they won't be in the store for long. It's Christmas at Target.
Houston's powerful women, tonight.
Geneva, 1955, the first post-war summit. In an atmosphere of hope, President Eisenhower speaks of the spirit of Geneva, a sentiment echoed by Americans watching and waiting back home.
We in Geneva, New York, are like the people in Geneva, Switzerland. We hope that peace and understanding will come out of this meeting for all mankind.
Geneva, 1985, another superpower summit. The players changed, but was that spirit of Geneva still there? We'll ask the experts, talk to residents of Geneva, Illinois, and hear from President Reagan himself.
This is a CBS News Special Report. The President's return from the summit. From CBS News headquarters in Washington, here is Dan Rather.
Good evening. What we're seeing live from your nation's capital is the helicopter carrying President and Mrs. Reagan to Capitol Hill, where President Reagan will address a joint session of the United States Congress. On the same day that his Geneva summit with Mikhail Gorbachev ended, President Reagan will report to the Congress and to you, the American people, about what they did and did not accomplish. That address is expected to begin very shortly. An interesting note about what we're seeing here, a wonderful shot as the helicopter goes by the Washington Monument. This is somewhat reminiscent of the arrival back from the 1972 summit meeting of President Nixon with Leonid Brezhnev. You recall that President Nixon had just returned from his summit with Brezhnev, and he also took a helicopter ride to Capitol Hill. He also addressed the Congress with what was, by everybody's standard, major summit news to talk about at the time, the SALT I Treaty. The scene was very similar to this. The anticipation probably greater at that time, because everyone recognized the importance of the SALT I Treaty, which we may be discussing as the evening goes along. In this case, a summit that has ended with more emphasis on procedures and a process being established, a dialogue, what President Reagan already has called a fireside summit, than on any specific substantive accomplishments. But this is precisely what President Reagan wants to talk about tonight, the framework that he feels was put down in Geneva, which will allow perhaps some progress in the three, what we consider to be most important areas: arms control, so-called areas of regional tension, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Ethiopia, Angola, and so forth. And then, of course, the very important area of human rights. The helicopter just sweeping past the Capitol Dome. Perhaps you saw it just in the left corner of your screen. The weather in Washington is cool, going to cold, and bad weather is threatening. However, there never was any doubt at any time during the day that President and Mrs. Reagan's Air Force One would be right on time at Andrews Air Force Base, and their helicopter arrival at the United States Capitol right on time for this scheduled to start just after 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central Time appearance before the Congress of the United States. We're told, by the way, that security is even tighter than usual at the Capitol tonight. There are more police on patrol. All parking in the Capitol Plaza has been banned. The building itself is closed to visitors. Perhaps we should pause here and you can see the blinking lights of the President's helicopter as it approaches the United States Capitol. After all, we don't often get this kind of view. If President Reagan is feeling a bit jet-lagged, who could blame him? He has plenty of good reason. And the President has said, by the way, that neither he nor Mrs. Reagan sleeps all that well on airplanes, and that's too bad. It contributes, of course, to the jet lag feeling. The President's day, this day, has been something on the order of incredible in terms of travel through time zones and different situations. His day began in Geneva, then it was on to Brussels by plane, then another plane ride back to Washington, and then this helicopter trip to the Capitol. A total, oh, what a beautiful sight. We were saying that the total trip was about 9.5 hours in the air today for the President and Mrs. Reagan, but remember, that started with, in Geneva with the joint appearance with Mikhail Gorbachev, then on to Brussels, and now on to the Capitol. All of that, a lot of shifting and changing around involving automobile rides, and heavy security in addition to planes and helicopters. It's now about 3 in the morning on Mr. Reagan's body clock, that is his Geneva clock. The Marine Guard in place, the President and Mrs. Reagan preparing to disembark from the helicopter to go into the Capitol. The Reagan-Gorbachev summit, much anticipated, watched the world over, is now history. Now the post-summit analysis begins in earnest. What does it all mean? The President, with his usual crisp salute to the honor guard for him, Mrs. Reagan in her favorite red, House Speaker Tip O'Neill in the somewhat rumpled raincoat, which I suppose is about as common to Tip O'Neill as a red dress would be to the First Lady. We heard some reports this afternoon that First Lady Nancy Reagan found Raisa Gorbachev not one too willing to talk about such things as family matters, religion, such things as how to whip the worldwide problem of drugs among the young. Told that Mrs. Reagan found Raisa Gorbachev one wanting to give little lecturettes, if one could call them that, in Marxist dogma. Also coming out from various administration officials late this afternoon and this evening, backgrounding on how the President feels about what was and was not accomplished vis-a-vis Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviets on human rights. And that word was that while there was very little specific about human rights, one could say nothing specific about human rights in the joint statement issued, that the President had made it clear that he intends to take personal charge of dealing with human rights on a person-to-person, on a personal basis with Mikhail Gorbachev. And that may be something that you'll hear a great deal more about as the days go along. The joint statement issued in Geneva today was not a joint communique, as that sometimes those joint communiques come out of such sessions. But in the case in Geneva, the Soviets had pressed very hard for a joint communique. President Reagan didn't want them to have a joint communique, didn't want to issue one, didn't really want to come out with a joint statement, we're told. But in the last hours of negotiating, President Reagan agreed to put out a joint statement. And for those of you who've been following the news coverage through the day, you may know that that joint statement was very short on specific details. It did, as we said earlier, outline in broad general terms a process by which the dialogue that President Reagan feels he started with Mikhail Gorbachev can continue. And it was made plain in that joint statement, perhaps one in journalistic terms would call it the lead out of the joint statement, was that the two men agreed to get together again in another summit soon, in what, and I quote directly from the joint statement now, is called the nearest future, quote unquote. I'm not sure what the nearest future would be. It apparently will mean sometime in 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev coming to the United States and President Reagan possibly going to the Soviet Union sometime in 1987. However, the joint statement did not mention any specific dates. It simply said that the two men would be getting together soon in, quote, the nearest future. Beyond that, there was talk of a process, some procedures being set up to discuss arms control. From the Soviet standpoint, most important for them, and for that matter for President Reagan as well, that President Reagan did not come off of his basic position that he wants to continue, he's determined to continue with research on the Strategic Defense Initiative, the so-called Star Wars defense. The Soviets wanted to make this a Star Wars defense summit. They were not able to do that. President Reagan held firm. Nowhere in the joint statement was there any promise by President Reagan, nothing even approaching that the United States would not go ahead with its Star Wars defense, the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, and perhaps President Reagan will want to address that in his remarks to the nation tonight. Now, as the President has gone into the Capitol now, you saw his helicopter landed, they took him by automobile, the short distance to the Capitol. He and Mrs. Reagan will sort of put themselves together in a holding room in the Capitol, and very shortly the President's address will be coming up. Leslie Stahl is at the White House, just back from Geneva herself. Leslie, what have we learned about what happened in Geneva that we didn't know this morning when we read that joint statement?
Well, officials on the press plane coming over here just a couple of hours ago, Dan, told us that they think the two leaders saw each other in the same way, and I quote, as iron fists in velvet gloves, because they both argued their points agreeably, but neither man gave an inch. The U.S. delegation was surprised in the first meeting by Gorbachev's congeniality. But several times during the summit, Mr. Reagan told his aides, we cannot lose sight of our own interests here. We cannot be moved just because we like this man. In the session on arms control, we're told that Gorbachev made 3 points on SDI or Star Wars. The first is that if you progress, then we will build up our offensive weapons. The second is we'll build SDI too, only cheaper and better. And the third is that SDI can't work. Mr. Reagan replied, I don't know if it can work. I'm trying to find out. Even in the group meetings, we're told the two leaders did 99% of the talking, very often making points such as, I disagree, that's wrong, no, that's not right. And Gorbachev again said that the U.S. has a military buildup because the defense industry is so powerful. But Mr. Reagan replied that we have a military buildup because of Soviet aggression in Afghanistan and Nicaragua and Ethiopia. And he also said that we cannot improve things simply because you and I have nice smiles and because there are good vibrations between us. Despite the disagreements, Mr. Reagan is said to have found Mr. Gorbachev to have a nice personality. And the other officials, the other U.S. officials, found the two men were somewhat similar, that they were both pleasant, they were both good talkers and raconteurs. And indeed, we're told that at dinner they told each other of the movies they had both seen of each other's countries. Mr. Reagan told them of his days in Hollywood. But aides say they still would not call these two men friends now, said they wouldn't want to go on a vacation together. And yet Mr. Reagan is eager to show Gorbachev America, particularly California, probably next summer. The president feels that his objective and Gorbachev's were the same in the summit. They wanted to prove that they could manage the U.S.-Soviet relationship better than it ever had been done before, Dan.
Leslie, thank you very much. And as you know, Phil Jones is on Capitol Hill, and we may want to come back to you shortly, Leslie. But Phil, in the meantime, what will Congress be listening for in the President's address tonight? Among other things, they're listening to a president who has an extraordinarily high approval rating with the American public for a second-term president coming up in the midway point.
Well, that's true, Dan, and I think I have found here today a bipartisan mood, Republicans and Democrats generally giving the president very high marks for what he accomplished in Geneva. And I think the White House is going a long way to keep this bipartisan mood going. They invited Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, to go out to Andrews and fly back in the chopper with the president tonight. And as the Speaker pointed out, they even asked Mrs. O'Neill to come and sit in the chamber tonight by Mrs. Reagan. But I think that what I've also found, a number of the members are saying they want to hear more than they have read in the joint statement that came out of Geneva. And they're not just exactly sure how they should feel about it. You're finding some conservatives in the Republican ranks who are very skeptical and discouraged over what they have read was accomplished in the area of chemical warfare and in human rights. So this is just the beginning. And even though the president is very popular and everybody's aware of this and it could help Republicans in 1986, it's just beginning for the president because now he's going to have liberals pushing for some immediate movement on something in the area of arms control and human rights. And you're going to have the conservatives watching over the president's shoulder to make sure, as they put it, that he doesn't give away the company store.
Phil, some of those conservatives that you mentioned didn't want the president to go to the summit at all. Their major disappointment is he went.
Before he left, I think there were 31 senators who signed a resolution urging him not to go too far and making concessions with the Russians. I think generally they're relieved because they see this thing in very broad terms at this point, and apparently nothing did happen in the area, and to that extent they're tickled.
Correspondent David Martin, our Defense Department correspondent, is standing by at the Pentagon. David, I would think that spirits would be high, generally speaking, at least around Secretary of Defense Weinberger, in that he didn't read in the joint statement what he feared he might be reading of specifics on arms control agreements.
That's right, Dan. The Secretary issued a statement today in which he said, quote, he is very pleased with the outcome of the summit, and aides to Weinberger said that that was a deliberately low-key statement. Remember that the summit began with a leak of a letter Weinberger had sent the president in which he recommended that he not give an inch on Star Wars. And unless something happened in Geneva that we don't know about, the president did not give an inch on Star Wars or on any of the other issues that Secretary Weinberger warned him about. So Secretary Weinberger feels that his hardline policies have been vindicated in spades at the summit.
And this is not the first time, nor one would guess would it be the last, that Caspar Weinberger prevails in his advice to President Reagan. David, thank you very much. Back at the Capitol, President and Mrs. Reagan are preparing to enter the... We're pausing for just a second to see if there'd been some delay, but we're told no, there has not been any delay, and the President and Mrs. Reagan, the doorkeeper, will be announcing the President of the United States in a few seconds. So let's just stop and listen and watch.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
Secretary of State Schultz, Defense Secretary Weinberger, members of the Cabinet, Elizabeth Dole, Ronald Reagan, Vernon Walters, the new UN ambassador, Vice President Bush, and Speaker O'Neill, shaking hands with a refreshed-looking President Reagan.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Members of the Congress,
Members of the Congress, I have the high privilege and the distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, members of the Congress, distinguished guests, and my fellow Americans. It's great to be home, and Nancy and I thank you for this wonderful homecoming. And before I go on, I want to say a personal thank you to Nancy. She was an outstanding ambassador of goodwill for all of us. She didn't know I was going to say that. But, well, Mr. Speaker, Senator Dole, I want you to know that your statements of support here were greatly appreciated. You can't imagine how much it means in dealing with the Soviets to have the Congress, the Allies, and the American people firmly behind you. I guess you know that I've just come from Geneva and talks with General Secretary Gorbachev. In the past few days, the past 2 days, we spent over 15 hours in various meetings with the General Secretary and the members of his official party. And approximately 5 of those hours were talks between Mr. Gorbachev and myself, just one-on-one. That was the best part, our fireside summit. There will be, I know, a great deal of commentary and opinion as to what the meetings produced and what they were like. There were over 3,000 reporters in Geneva, so it's possible there will be 3,000 opinions on what happened. So, maybe it's the old broadcaster in me, but I decided to file my own report directly to you. We met as we had to meet. I called for a fresh start, and we made that start. I can't claim that we had a meeting of the minds on such fundamentals as ideology or national purpose, but we understand each other better, and that's a key to peace. I gained a better perspective. I feel he did too. It was a constructive meeting, so constructive, in fact, that I look forward to welcoming Mr. Gorbachev to the United States next year. And I have accepted his invitation to go to Moscow the following year. We arranged that out in the parking lot. I found Mr. Gorbachev to be an energetic defender of Soviet policy. He was an eloquent speaker and a good listener. Our subject matter was shaped by the facts of this century. These past 40 years have not been an easy time for the West or for the world. You know the facts. There is no need to recite the historical record. Suffice it to say that the United States cannot afford illusions about the nature of the USSR. We cannot assume that their ideology and purpose will change. This implies enduring competition. Our task is to assure that this competition remains peaceful. With all that divides us, we cannot afford to let confusion complicate things further. We must be clear with each other and direct. We must pay each other the tribute of candor. When I took the oath of office for the first time, We began dealing with the Soviet Union in a way that was more realistic than in, say, the recent past. And so in a very real sense, preparations for the summit started not months ago, but 5 years ago, when with the help of Congress, we began strengthening our economy, restoring our national will, and rebuilding our defenses and alliances. America is once again strong, and our strength has given us the ability to speak with confidence and see that no true opportunity to advance freedom and peace is lost. We must not now abandon policies that work. I need your continued support to keep America strong. That is the history behind the Geneva summit, and that is the context in which it occurred. And may I add that we were especially eager that our meetings give a push to important talks already underway on reducing nuclear weapons. On this subject, it would be foolish not to go the extra mile, or in this case, the extra 4,000 miles. We discussed the great issues of our time. I made clear before the first meeting that no question would be swept aside, no issue buried just because either side found it uncomfortable or inconvenient. I brought these questions to the summit and put them before Mr. Gorbachev. We discussed nuclear arms and how to reduce them. I explained our proposals for equitable, verifiable, and deep reductions. I outlined my conviction that our proposals would make not just for a world that feels safer, but one that is really safer. And I'm pleased to report tonight that General Secretary Gorbachev and I did make a measure of progress here. While we still have a long way to go, but we're still heading in the right direction. We moved arms control forward from where we were last January when the Soviets returned to the table. We are both instructing our negotiators to hasten their vital work, and the world is waiting for the results. Specifically, we agreed in Geneva that each side should move to cut offensive nuclear arms by 50% in appropriate categories. In our joint statement, we called for early progress on this, turning the talks toward our chief goal, offensive reductions. We called for an interim accord on intermediate-range nuclear forces, leading, I hope, to the complete elimination of this class of missiles. And all of this with tough verification. We also made progress in combating together the spread of nuclear weapons, an arms control area in which we've cooperated effectively over the years. We are also opening a dialogue on combating the spread and use of chemical weapons while moving to ban them altogether. Other arms control dialogues in Vienna on conventional forces and in Stockholm on lessening the chances for surprise attack in Europe also received a boost. And finally, we agreed to begin work on risk reduction centers, a decision that should give special satisfaction to Senators Nunn and Warner, who so ably promoted this idea. I described our strategic defense initiative, our research effort that envisions the possibility of defensive systems which could ultimately protect all nations against the danger of nuclear war. This discussion produced a very direct exchange of views. Mr. Gorbachev insisted that we might use a strategic defense system to put offensive weapons into space and establish nuclear superiority. I made it clear that SDI has nothing to do with offensive weapons, that instead we're investigating non-nuclear defense systems that would only threaten offensive missiles, not people. If our research succeeds, it will bring much closer the safer, more stable world that we seek. Nations could defend themselves against missile attack, and mankind at long last escape the prison of mutual terror. And this is my dream. So I welcome the chance to tell Mr. Gorbachev that we are a nation that defends rather than attacks, that our alliances are defensive, not offensive. We don't seek nuclear superiority. We do not seek a first strike advantage over the Soviet Union. Indeed, one of my fundamental arms control objectives is to get rid of first strike weapons altogether. And this is why we've proposed a 50% reduction in the most threatening nuclear weapons, especially those that could carry out a first strike. I went further in expressing our peaceful intentions. I described our proposal in the Geneva negotiations for a reciprocal program of open laboratories in strategic defense research. We're offering to permit Soviet experts to see firsthand that SDI does not involve offensive weapons. American scientists would be allowed to visit comparable facilities of the Soviet strategic defense program, which in fact has involved much more than research for many years. Finally, I reassured Mr. Gorbachev on another point. I promised that if our research reveals that a defense against nuclear missiles is possible, we would sit down with our allies and the Soviet Union to see how together we could replace all strategic ballistic missiles with such a defense which threatens no one. We discussed threats to the peace in several regions of the world. I explained my proposals for a peace process to stop the wars in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Ethiopia, Angola, and Cambodia. Those places where insurgencies that speak for the people are pitted against regimes which obviously do not represent the will or the approval of the people. I tried to be very clear about where our sympathies lie. I believe I succeeded. We discussed human rights. We Americans believe that history teaches no clearer lesson than this. Those countries which respect the rights of their own people tend inevitably to respect the rights of their neighbors. Human rights, therefore, is not an abstract moral issue, it is a peace issue. Finally, we discussed the barriers to communication between our societies, and I elaborated on my proposals for real people-to-people contacts on a wide scale. Americans should know the people of the Soviet Union, their hopes and fears and the facts of their lives. And citizens of the Soviet Union need to know of America's deep desire for peace and our unwavering attachment to freedom. As you can see, our talks were wide-ranging. And let me, at this point, tell you what we agreed upon and what we didn't. We remained far apart on a number of issues, as had to be expected. However, we reached agreement on a number of matters. And as I mentioned, we agreed to continue meeting, and this is important and very good. There's always room for movement, action, and progress when people are talking to each other instead of about each other. Well, we've concluded a new agreement designed to bring the best of America's artists and academics to the Soviet Union. The exhibits that will be included in this exchange are one of the most effective ways for the average Soviet citizen to learn about our way of life. This agreement will also expand the opportunities for Americans to experience the Soviet people's rich cultural heritage because their artists and academics will be coming here. We've also decided to go forward with a number of people-to-people initiatives that will go beyond greater contact, not only between the political leaders of our two countries, but our respective students, teachers, and others as well. We have emphasized youth exchanges, and this will help break down stereotypes, build friendships, and frankly, provide an alternative to propaganda. We've agreed to establish a new Soviet consulate in New York and a new American consulate in Kiev. And this will bring a permanent U.S. presence to the Ukraine for the first time in decades. And we have also, together with the government of Japan, concluded a Pacific Air Safety Agreement with the Soviet Union. This is designed to set up cooperative measures to improve civil air safety in that region of the Pacific. What happened before must never be allowed to happen there again. And as a potential way of dealing with the energy needs of the world of the future, we have also advocated international cooperation to explore the feasibility of developing fusion energy. All of these steps are part of a long-term effort to build a more stable relationship with the Soviet Union. No one ever said it could be easy, but we've come a long way. As for Soviet expansionism in a number of regions of the world, while there's little chance of immediate change, we will continue to support the heroic efforts of those who fight for freedom. But we have also agreed to continue and to intensify our meetings with the Soviets on this and other regional conflicts and to work toward political solutions. We know the limits as well as the promise of summit meetings. This is, after all, the 11th summit of the post-war era, and still the differences endure. But we believe continued meetings between the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union can help bridge those differences. The fact is, every new day begins with possibilities. It's up to us to fill it with the things that move us toward progress and peace. Hope, therefore, is a realistic attitude, and despair an uninteresting little vice. And so, was our journey worthwhile? Well, 30 years ago, when President Eisenhower had just returned from a summit in Geneva, he said, "The wide gulf that separates so far east and west is wide and deep." Well, today, 3 decades later, that is still true. But yes, this meeting was worthwhile for both sides. A new realism spawned the summit. The summit itself was a good start, and now our byword must be steady as we go. I am, as you are, impatient for results, but goodwill and good hopes do not always yield lasting results, and quick fixes don't fix big problems. Just as we must avoid illusions on our side, so we must dispel them on the Soviet side. I've made it clear to Mr. Gorbachev that we must reduce the mistrust and suspicions between us if we are to do such things as reduce arms. And this will take deeds, not words alone. And I believe he is in agreement. Where do we go from here? Well, our desire for improved relations is strong. We're ready and eager for step-by-step progress. We know that peace is not just the absence of war. We don't want a phony peace or a frail peace. We didn't go in pursuit of some kind of illusory détente. We can't be satisfied with cosmetic improvements that won't stand the test of time. We want real peace. As I flew back this evening, I had many thoughts. In just a few days, families across America will gather to celebrate Thanksgiving. And again, as our forefathers who voyaged to America, we travel to Geneva with peace as our goal and freedom as our guide. For there can be no greater good than the quest for peace, and no finer purpose than the preservation of freedom. It is 350 years since the first Thanksgiving, when pilgrims and Indians huddled together at the edge of an unknown continent. And now, here we are, gathered together on the edge of an unknown future. But, like our forefathers, really not so much afraid, but full of hope and trusting in God as ever. Thank you for allowing me to talk to you this evening, and God bless you all.
President Ronald Reagan, live from the capital of the United States, and on the back end of a very long and trying day, ending his first summit his summit session with the General Secretary of the Communist Party. President Reagan pointing out that he feels that the road to the summit started when he came into office in 1981, saying it was 5 years in the making. Just behind the President, the Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. Behind him, Senator Alan Cranston, Robert Byrd, West Virginia, just off the President's left. The President taking his time to make his way out of the House chamber. And as we've all come to expect, a rather remarkable performance in delivering his speech, among other things. Not one of his longer addresses. Crisp and to the point about what he believes the American people can and cannot expect out of this summit.
Mr. President, great job. Great speech. Welcome home.
Bill Moyers, our CBS News commentator who has been working these past few days with us in Geneva, stayed on in Geneva to catch up on his sleep, put a few thoughts together, and listen to the President's address. Bill, out of the President's speech, what did you think was the most important thing that he said, and where do we go from here?
Well, first of all, Dan, I want to say thank you for that encouragement to get some sleep. We'll do it just after this is over. I think that the President's sense of realism was the most encouraging thing about the speech. 30 years ago in the Geneva conference you were talking about, there was a great deal of unrealizable expectations when General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower came back from Geneva, and nothing really came out of that, and the American people's hopes were dashed. I admire what Mr. Reagan did here, his personal performance. He conducted himself reasonably and persuasively. He didn't let the blitz of Soviet propaganda overturn his bearings, and I was very impressed with how he conducted himself here, and I was impressed tonight with the political astuteness he showed in that speech. But I think the most important thing is that he said, don't get your hopes up, don't expect more than hard negotiations can produce, and let's get to the business of hard negotiations. The real test of a summit is whether or not it alters the basic power facts between the two countries and whether or not it leads to serious negotiations on the arms front. And those are issues that can only be decided in time. And the President was very wise, it seemed to me tonight, to say, I put the frame in place. I've got the process started, but it's going to take some very difficult, hard, long negotiations to see what we can get from it.
Bill, we have only a few seconds left before we want to take a break, but there have been, what, at least 11 summits in your lifetime, a lot of high-sounding rhetoric after each one of those summits. It's sometimes hard to tell in the immediate aftermath of the summit what, if anything, was accomplished. In your opinion, clearly labeled, what appears to be the accomplishment of this summit?
The establishment of a process, the putting of a frame around relationships, the clearing of the air of invective between these two over the last 5 years, the fresh start, he said. All right, let's put behind us our evil empire talk and our capitalist tool talk, and let's see if we can, despite our deep differences, get down to some agreements that we can both respect. As the old saying goes, time will tell.
Bill, thank you very much. Hope you do get caught up on your sleep. And we'll be back with our CBS News coverage of the President's address to Congress, including an interview with, from the Soviet point of view, in just a moment.
This is CBS. CBS News coverage of the president's return from the summit continues. Here again is Dan Rather.
The last line of almost every analysis of this summit reads in one way or another, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, otherwise known as Star Wars. What did Mikhail Gorbachev ask for? How did President Reagan respond? With us tonight in Geneva's early morning hours is a physicist who's considered to be the Kremlin's #1 Star Wars specialist. Dr. Yevgeny Velikov is the senior science advisor to Soviet leader Gorbachev, and he's also a vice president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Doctor, thank you very much for being with us this morning. What is the #1 thing accomplished at this summit from the Soviet point of view?
I think #1 is the possibility for two leaders who share a great responsibility for the future of this world to exchange the frankly and openly the view of the international and between country relation. I think another very important point is concentration of attention of billions of people on this planet on this very important and crucial important question of disarmament and weapons and space development, which is very important for our future. From point of view of what is divided us and what is united us, I think the joint understanding of nature of nuclear weapons and nuclear threat is united us.
Doctor, if I may...
of course...
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Of course, our understanding of weapons in space divided us, and Secretary General Gorbachev expressed his view what happens if we have no agreement to ban weapons in space.
But Doctor, let me ask you about that, if I may, about banning weapons in space. You're quite right. The General Secretary did talk about the importance of that. But he hasn't talked about the fact that the Soviet Union is already developing its own Star Wars defense, and that you are, among others, in charge of it.
No, it's a big misunderstanding. We're not interested, we're just not interested to develop any Star Wars defense because we think it is destabilizing system and it is give to us much less security for both nations. And the view of the Secretary General, what has happened in 10 years, is the world in which thousands of weapons just fly hundreds of miles from head of the American people and head from Russian people, and increase the tension if we not ban space weapons altogether. Of course, it is different view of possibility to build the impenetrable shield against nuclear weapons, and to which express President of United States and his view of importance to build such system and test this. And I think the problem is how test the defensive system, because before this in history we have only one choice to test defense against offense.
Doctor, I think all will agree that that's the case, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but time moves on with us. Dr. Velikov, we do very much appreciate you being with us, and we'll look forward to an opportunity to discuss this further with you at another time. Thank you very much. We also have with us tonight 3 experts from past summits. They all played key roles in the posturing and the bargaining and the accomplishments. Theodore Sorensen, President Kennedy's trusted advisor at the 1961 summit with Khrushchev. Prince Scowcroft, the top military advisor, among other things, to President Nixon at the 1972 summit. And Harold Brown, Jimmy Carter's defense secretary, who's been involved in arms control negotiations for most of his adult life. First, General Scowcroft, we know that your former boss, Richard Nixon, gave President Reagan some coaching for this summit. Could you see any sign of that during the summit and what the president put in the joint statement and what he said to the people tonight?
Well, I think there was, I don't know whether there's evidence of whatever conversations that President Nixon had with with President Reagan. But I think that from whatever source, the President did a very good job, both at the summit in accomplishing the goals he set for himself and in his report to the nation just now.
Dr. Brown, this is the last summit the two leaders can call a success just by smiling. Next time they'll have to get down to hard cases and some specifics, one would think, arms control among them. Do you think this summit in any way helped move that process along?
It is difficult to tell from what's been said publicly. Certainly the agreement to continue the dialogue allows an opportunity to move forward. And I think that perhaps is the greatest achievement of this summit. The President did, I noticed, put arms control very early in his speech and highlighted it by doing that. There's very little sign that he changed his views about the nature of arms control or what's desirable in arms control, or that Secretary General Gorbachev did either. There is one paragraph in the President's speech that cries out for elaboration, and perhaps we'll have it in subsequent press conferences and backgrounders. When he says, specifically, we agreed in Geneva that each side should move to cut offensive nuclear arms by 50% in appropriate categories. Of course, the two sides have very different appropriate categories in mind. And then he says that we could turn toward our chief goal, offensive reductions. It's not clear to me that Gorbachev has agreed to that statement. There's every sign that President Reagan is determined to hold to his dream about the Strategic Defense Initiative, and I believe there's every sign that Secretary General Gorbachev holds to his dream of completely prohibiting it. The real question is whether in private either or both of them gave a sign that they are willing to negotiate on this issue, to carry out at least research which would legitimize the research that academician Velikov supervises in the Soviet Union, for example. And we probably won't know that for some time. I hope we know it before the next summit.
Theodore Sorensen, in your judgment as one who was involved in summitry, what is the single most important thing for the American public to know about this summit?
I believe the most important aspect of this summit is the fact that it was held. President Reagan said tonight, we've come a long way, and no one's come further than Ronald Reagan himself, because the Ronald Reagan we heard tonight in a very eloquent speech with a very constructive tone is totally different from the Ronald Reagan who condemned the Soviet Union as an evil empire led by men who would cheat and steal and lie and who were presiding over a corrupt system that was about to collapse. I think starting the process is healthy. I think opening the dialogue is good. There were no substantive achievements at this summit other than some rather unimportant bilateral gains, but I don't underestimate the importance of having the President of the United States and the General Secretary of the Soviet Union speaking in the right tone.
General Scowcroft, let me come back to you for a moment. There is a school of thought that says seldom is freedom more in peril than when an American president sits down with the leader of the Soviet Union at one of these summits. Clearly you don't agree with that. But to those who cling to that view and they point out their version of what happened at Yalta, what happened at Potsdam, what happened eventually to Détente, there is some substance to that point of view, is there not?
I think one of the problems is that Americans assume goodwill on both sides, and that both sides are seriously looking for an agreement which will mean the same for both sides. And therefore we make some assumptions which are unwarranted. I think it unlikely that President Reagan will be susceptible to that, although certainly some of the comments from conservatives were worried about what he might do at the summit. They should be greatly reassured by, in fact, what happened. I think we have to realize that the Soviet Union is a tough negotiator, that personalities are not a bridge to the deep and substantive differences between us, and that there is no substitute for serious, hard negotiations to reach agreements which are not susceptible of the kinds of misinterpretations that sometimes have taken place in the past.
Ted Sorensen, we have, unfortunately, because the President's address ran a little late, only a few seconds left, telltale signs to look for. What are signs to look for that perhaps more was accomplished at this summit than we believe, or the converse of that?
If we have specific announcements by either capital that guidelines are going to be given on specifics to their negotiators, if they reaffirm the strict language of the ABM Treaty, if they reaffirm their pledge to live up to SALT II, if they take hard language of that kind, then we'll know something real was accomplished.
Thank you very much, Ted Sorensen, Harold Brown, and Brent Scowcroft. Looking back on the week, we wondered what it was, what it meant. What did we remember? Well, we knew that we were expecting an older man in pursuit of a legacy, a younger man in search of a future, and we hoped that we would be somewhere in between.
And then they were almost there. But there was contradiction in their coming, a reversing of the image. The leader of the free world arrived in the dark. The leader of the unfree world arrived in the light. Both arrived in the cold. Then there was the handshake, the touch, and that was good. A little fall, a start. There was concern, too. The concern of a young man with a coat for the old man without in the cold. So they went inside and talked, and for a while it was warm. But more important, they were together. The secret weapons of this summit were together, too. The wives. And that was good.
We sing for the children of the world.
Children sang to one wife. Grown men shouted at the other. Then they touched too, hand in hand. Not long, but long enough. And still the leaders met and talked. But not to us. It was too soon. We looked for signs. We tried to read what they wore, but that was only smiles. It was too soon to talk to us.
And now they have begun to talk to us. In their first words, some signs of hope, at least of some dialogue. What kind of future, what substantial agreement the words and the meetings will lead to, we are only beginning to see and hear tonight. Dan Rather for CBS News, reporting tonight from Washington. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Good evening from CBS News. This is Newsbreak. President Reagan spoke to Congress and the American people on his return from Geneva tonight. He called the summit talks with Soviet Chairman Gorbachev constructive and thorough and said they provided a fresh start for East-West relations. Now this.
I ate Chunky, the soup that eats like a meal. It's full of big pieces of solid food. After all, when you're competing with people half your age, you need all the help you can get.
Chunky, the soup that eats like a meal.
2 French secret agents were sentenced to 10 years in jail in New Zealand today for their roles in the sinking of the Greenpeace protest ship, the Rainbow Warrior. One crew member was killed in the bombing of that ship last July. Hurricane Kate ripped across the Florida Panhandle today with 100-mile-an-hour winds. The first November hurricane to hit the U.S. mainland in 50 years. 3 communities reported extensive damage to beachfront properties. I'm Bill Curtis, CBS News, Chicago.
This is CBS.